Hey everybody, I'm Laura Nelkin. I'm a knitwear designer. I live in upstate New York in the Finger Lakes region, and this is a tips and tricks tutorial for Roll in the Hay. Roll in the Hay is September 2024 Lola's Choice kit. I pretty much think all of you have been waiting to roll in the hay with Lola. I know she's been waiting to roll in the hay with you for quite some time. If you don't know what Lola's Choice is my small knitted kit club. If you aren't a member, I do hope that you will join us at some point. It's an absolute blast. We keep things really fun, and I get to dive into new techniques and share them with you. So let me tell you a bit about Roll in the Hay. With Roll in the Hay, you get to dye your own yarn with resist dyeing so that you can knit a cowl that has assigned pulling. I use these really awesome dye kits from Wool Tincture Dyes that are an acid dye to dye yarn. And then once you have resist dyed your yarn, you will end up knitting Roll in the Hay Cowl. Roll in the Hay Cowl has a garter stitch border on each side and a stockinette stitch body with my Hay Bale stitch in it. Those of you who've been knitting my projects for a while, that Hay Bale stitch is going to be a little bit familiar to you. Now, what's really fun is that your yarn kind of does the driving during this section of the cowl, and it will tell you when it is time to work that hay bale stitch. So in this video, I'm going to go over materials that you'll need for Roll in the Hay. I'll teach you tips and tricks for working that hay bale stitch, how assigned pooling works. I think it's important to note that you will need the pattern to follow along. I will link to that below. So let's jump right in with the materials. I'm so excited to go over this with you. Okay, first I'm going to go over what is in your kit, and then I'll tell you about all the other supplies that you'll need to gather. The first thing, which I love and I'm thrilled to tell you about, is the yarn that I found for us to dye together. And this yarn is a fingering weight yarn. I sourced it from Germany. It is an organic, durable merino silk and rammy yarn. It's 60% merino, 20% silk, 20% rammy. Rammy is also linen, for those of you who don't know what rammy is. It's really lovely yarn. It's got fabulous drape and it feels great against the skin as a cowl. The other thing I love about it is that it soaks up the dye really, really beautifully, and I think you're gonna just love the magic of that dyeing step. So you've got a 50-gram skein of this yarn, which has, let's look at the skein so I get this right, it has about 232 yards on it. The next thing that you have in your kit is a packet from Wool Tincture Dyes. So this packet has 2 envelopes on the inside. They're basically like 2 little tea bags, which makes this whole process like not messy at all. It's really low fuss. This is an acid dye, so these are dyes that you would use on wool or protein fibers like silk and wool. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about this is the linen's not going to soak up the dye at the same rate as the wool and the silk, which makes your yarn seem almost like a little bit heathered, which I think adds to like the surface interest of this project. So other things in your kit is a zip tie, which my buddy Lola has. This is one of Lola's favorite tools. I like them also. And the zip tie just kind of helps you keep your yarn organized while you're dyeing it. You'll see how I use it in the video. You certainly don't need to use it, but I found it a really nice way to like lift my skein up and out of the dye bath and then also hang it while it was drying. The other thing that you got in your kit is a spool of buttonhole thread. Now, this is the thread that I use all the time for lifelines, and you'll only be using a little bit of it when you do the resist dyeing, and the rest of it you can throw into your knitting bag or basket to use as lifeline material. So you'll be using this when you are wrapping the yarn to create that resist section. So these are all of the things that came in your kit besides well, the postcard, right, came in your kit, and that's got your PDF download code in it. But the other things that you're going to need, I'm just going to kind of clear these out of the way so you know what else you need. You are going to need a portable scale, and this will help you get the most out of your yarn when you're dyeing your cowl. Sorry, not when you're dyeing your cowl, when you're knitting your cowl. What you'll do is weigh your yarn before you start knitting, and then you'll knit the border and weigh your yarn again, and that's how much yarn your border uses, and it lets you know how much of the body you can work in that stockinette stitch with the hay bale stitch before you work the border on the other end. So I think all knitters should have a portable scale. For the dyeing, you'll need some kind of stirring stick. I just use a chopstick from our local Chinese food place where we get Chinese food, and as much as we always say don't throw in chopsticks, they do. And I have a pile of them, and they turn out to be perfect for stirring. When you get to the knitting, you'll also need a stitch marker. You'll need a needle for getting gauge. I used a US size 4 needle. This is about a 20 to 22 inch long needle. You can work with like a 16 to 20 inch circular needle for knitting your cowl. Of course, you'll want to choose a needle size that you get gauge with, and we'll talk about that next. You are going to need a measuring tape, and you're going to need some sharp scissors. And then finally, you're going to need a piece of plastic wrap for wrapping your yarn when you go to do that resist dyeing. And there's one more thing. You are also going to need a jar. You're going to need a jar that carries about or holds about 1 liter of water. You want it to be a jar that is glass or non-reactive. We'll talk a bit in the dyeing instructions more about that and where to find out information so that you have all those materials set up and ready to go for yourself. So once you've gathered all of that, the next thing to look at is preparing your yarn for the resist dyeing before you go to dye it. So let's do that next. Okay, our goal with this step is to end up with a section of our skein that is undyed. So I have a skein here to show you that's already dyed with that section so you can see what we're doing to our undyed skein. Now, the directions for doing this are on page 2 of your pattern. And I learned from doing one skein. I had one skein when I was wrapping it on my skein holder where it was really, really tight on the skein holder. And I found that what happened is when I released it off of there, I actually wrapped too small of an area. So you'll either want to do this on a tabletop or have it loose on a skein holder the way I have it, so there's no tension on there. And basically what we're doing is wrapping 2 spots on our skein that are about 4.5 inches apart from each other. It's important to do this wrap where there aren't any of these like ties that are typically on your skein of hand-dyed yarn that kind of keep the yarn all in order while you're dyeing it. So you can see I'm at a section that doesn't have any one of those ties, and I've kind of tied my buttonhole thread around there a little bit. And the goal as you wrap it is to get it really, really tight. So in the beginning, you're going to be like, that's not tight enough. I'm not going to be resisting that yarn. Any of you who've tie-dyed in the past, this is going to feel somewhat familiar. I'm just wrapping this around and around and around. I would say like at least 10 times, if not a little bit more. And once you have a nice tight, tight, tight little bundle right there, what you'll do, let me just get one more, is kind of wrap around loosely a few times to get to the next point. And then you'll want to grab a measuring tape. And I'm going to kind of grab my measuring tape to show this to you. And you want to get to about 4.5 inches. So you can see I'm right about there where that wrap is. So I've kind of eyeballed it very carefully. And now I am going to continue on the other side to wrap tightly. And when you get this going, before you're like too deep into it, you might want to stop and measure and make sure you're at about 4.5 inches, because that is how much yarn you need to do that hay bale stitch with the white resisted section of yarn. So you're going to wrap around here, and then once you have two nice tight wraps, the next thing you're going to do is take a piece of plastic wrap. What I did was take a piece of my like saran wrap or whatever we have downstairs in the kitchen, and I took about a 12-inch piece and folded it in half. You can also take a plastic bag, like a grocery bag, and cut it up, whatever you need for a piece of plastic. What you're going to notice with this plastic wrap is it's a little too wide, and that is okay, because as you do this wrap, it is going to get a little bit smaller. But if you feel like it's too wide, what you can do is kind of go to one edge and fold it over a little bit so that it is a little bit more like that 4.5 inch size. And then you're just going to start to wrap this around your yarn really tight. Most of the time I've ended up doing 2 layers of this plastic wrap, because I find that just having more on there and making sure no dye is going to seep underneath is helpful. And once you get all that plastic wrap on, then you're going to continue to wrap around the plastic wrap with your buttonhole thread. And now, like any good cooking show, I'm going to move this cake out of the way. And I am going to grab a skein that I finished wrapping to show you what this looks like when you're done wrapping it. So this one has 2 layers of plastic over it. It's bound at each side really tightly so the dye cannot get into this whole section. So when we go to dye it and we take this off afterwards, this section will be completely white. What I do after I have gotten this skein ready, the last step that I do to prepare is I take the zip tie and I just get it onto my yarn. I love the sound that zip ties make when you do that little zip tie. I don't go totally tight on it, but I make it so it can move if necessary. But you'll find that you can just kind of hold on to the skein right there where that plastic is, and it will make it really easy to do the dyeing step. So once we've done that, the next thing that we get to do is dye. So let us talk about that next. Okay, now that you've prepared your yarn, it is time to dye. All of the instructions for dyeing are on page 2 of your pattern. I highly suggest you read through those, and then also it's really important to click the link on page 2 and download the instructions from Wool Tinctures Dye. These instructions are really helpful. They go through every step in detail. Read this all, read what I've written up for you. Gather everything that you need for dyeing, because it happens surprisingly quickly, and you might not want to be like running off to get some gloves or running off to get your stirring stick. Get everything together. And then the first thing that I like to do that's a little different from the Wool Tincture Dye instructions is it's important to warm up whatever you're dyeing in a little bit, particularly so you don't pour like super hot water into a cold glass jar, because that might make it crack. So what I did was take some warm water, not super hot, but warm, and I soaked my yarn in it for about like 20 minutes. It's important to soak your yarn before you dye it so that the dye can penetrate the yarn really well. And the longer you soak it and make sure that it's really wetted, the better the better it's going to dye and the deeper your color is going to be. So I did that right in my jar, just not to like have another dish that I needed to clean, but it's not totally necessary if you want to use another bowl or whatever you have lying around. So the first thing you're going to do is get that yarn soaking in warm water, and then you're going to prep everything else. It does take a little bit of time to warm up your water. We have a kettle, like a tea kettle, that has a temperature temperature setting on it. So I just used that, but you need about 1 liter of water. So it was actually 2 kettles full for me, which took a little bit of time to get all of that warm. So once you've gathered everything, your wool is wetted, then you're ready to get dyeing. And I have a little dyeing video, but first I want to show you something because you get to make a decision at the very end of your dyeing as to whether you want that white section in your yarn to be really white and your yarn to be as dark as possible, or if you want your yarn to be a little bit lighter and then have that resisted section in your yarn be just like a little bit stained. So if we look below on the camera, I have samples of both. Actually, my swatch over here is a really good sample of it, so you can see the difference here. The cowl that I knit, what I did, I didn't want it to be like very white and very plum. So what I did is at the very end of the dyeing, when the yarn had been in the dye bath about like 20-ish minutes, I took all of my plastic wrap and string off of my skein and I dunked my skein back into the dye bath. Now the dye bath wasn't like totally exhausted. There was still a little bit of dye in there. And I stirred it around just for like a minute or two to let that white yarn get stained and just like a little bit penetrated with the extra dye. And then I pulled it out. What that did was make my yarn not quite as strongly dyed because I didn't let it stay in the dye bath until the dye bath was completely cool. I pulled it out a little bit early, and it also stained that white to make it not quite so optic. And I think you can see between these two, like the swatch that I have on the needles and the cowl that's underneath it, the difference where, and this one I let it sit all the way until the dye bath was totally cool, and this one I pulled it out early. Definitely let me know if you have any questions about it. My testers did it both ways. All their cowls look awesome. I think that's just personal preference if you want that really bright white or if you want it kind of dulled down just a little bit. So once you've made that decision and you know what you're doing, you're going to jump right in with the dyeing, and let me show you that. We made a little video out in the garden showing you every step. First, pour your hot water into your jar. Then take your dye packet and put that into the jar. You can also start by having your dye packet in the jar and pour water in there. Now it's really important when you put that dye packet into the jar that you stir it around, dissolving all of the dye out of the dye packet. When you're done and all of the dye is dissolved, go ahead and just toss that baby out of there. You don't want to have that packet in your water anymore. Then take the yarn that you have prepared and wetted in warm water and squeeze it out. See, I'm really squeezing it hard, getting all of the extra water out of it. And then I'm shaking it to line up all of the fibers and gently putting it into the dye jar. You'll see that I'll lift it up and down a few times. The goal right now is to be gently stirring so that the dye is penetrating the fibers and really like getting into all of those little bits of your yarn. And you're going to want to do this for like 2, 3, 4 minutes. You can let it sit for a little while, stir it again. You can use that chopstick to hang your skein with the zip tie, which is brilliant. And after that, like 2, 3, 4 minutes, you'll go ahead and take your citric acid packet, and you can either take your yarn out of the jar and put the citric acid packet in, or you can just push your yarn to the side, and then you'll want to stir it, dissolving that citric acid packet. What happens when the acid gets into the hot water is it starts to bond the dye molecules to your fiber. So you'll notice that your yarn is going to get significantly darker once you get your acid in there. And you're going to let it sit for about like 20-ish minutes, and you'll see that your dye bath will almost exhaust, like all of the dye will bond with your fiber. And then when all of your dye has bonded, it is time to cut off that resist packaging that you have put onto your skein. Be super careful doing this step. You don't want to cut your yarn by mistake. That's why sometimes that 2 layers of plastic can be really helpful. And then you'll unwrap the plastic and just be amazed with yourself. You'll have this white area that is resisted, and look at that. You just dyed your own yarn. Okay, once you have dyed your yarn and it has dried, it is time to get knitting. And the first thing that you need to do is work a gauge swatch. Now you might say to me, Laura, come on, it's just a cowl, it's gonna fit, I don't need to do gauge. But actually, to get the assigned pooling to work, that 4.5 inch section that is undyed, you want that to fall pretty in line for the hay bale stitch. And if you get the gauge called for in the pattern and you've got about that 4.5 inch section undyed on your yarn, then the hay bale stitch is going to work out mostly with the undyed yarn. So that's why you want to get gauge. But I have a little treat for you, because this yarn, like some superwash yarns do, turns out to be the same gauge blocked and unblocked. So you don't need to do a blocked gauge swatch. You can do an unblocked gauge swatch. And when you get gauge, you can pull out your swatch and then get knitting with your cowl. I think people always love that when they don't need to do a block swatch. It's like a little extra bonus right there, right? So the gauge that you want for this pattern is 22 stitches by 30 rounds equals 4 inches blocked and unblocked. That's in stockinette stitch, which means you are knitting every round. For those of you that are a little newer to working gauge, if a pattern is worked in the round, then you want to work your gauge swatch in the round. And I have a really cool trick for working gauge swatches in the round so that you're always working on the right side of your work and knitting every row as you work the gauge swatch. I have a little swatch with the hay bale stitch on it underneath, and I worked this swatch with the same technique, and you can see over on the left side of the swatch I have all of these little kind of twirls of extra yarn that are left over from working this swatching in the round technique flat. If you've never worked this before, I have a separate video that goes over it in detail. I have linked it in the pattern and I will link it below in this video for you. So you're going to want to get 22 stitches by 30 rounds. Stitch gauge is definitely way more important than round gauge for this pattern, so you'll want to go ahead and make sure that you get the stitch gauge. And once you have that stitch gauge, rip out your swatch and you get to start knitting. And let's go over how to do that hay bale stitch together next. Finally, it is time to roll in the hay together. Are you excited? Now, I gotta say, this is a pretty simple pattern for me as patterns go. I think that dyeing step just added to the fun. And so this pattern, this cowl is just gonna fly off your needles and it's gonna be so fun to wear come fall. So this pattern starts with a German twisted cast on and it ends with an Icelandic bind off. I am not showing you both of those techniques in this video because I have separate videos for them. They're also linked in the pattern and I'll put those links below for you. I already in the materials section talked about why you want that scale. Use your scale if you want to make your cowl as big as possible and get the most out of your yarn. I explained a bit how to do that in the materials section. But once you have done the cast on and that first border, now you are going to jump into the body of your cowl, and this is where your yarn takes over and tells you what to do. And every third time you get to the undyed section of your yarn, you are going to be wrapping your yarn 3 times for 3 stitches. And let me show you what that looks like on my needles. So I'm at the 3rd undyed section right here, and I'm going to into the next stitch on my left hand needle, and now I'm going to wrap my yarn around that stitch 3 times, and I am going to pull that through. And then I'm going to do that a second time. And then I'm going to go ahead and do that a third time. Now, don't worry too much if you end up with like a little bit of plum on the first wrap of the first stitch or a little bit of plum on the first wrap of the last stitch. It's not going to matter at all. The goal is when you get to that undyed section, you'll work 3 stitches wrapping 3 times. Now, when you come to these stitches on the next round, you're going to be dropping those extra wraps and working the Bale stitch. So let me just work up to that point on this swatch and then I'll show you how to do that. Okay, I have just gotten to those 3 wrapped stitches. And now with my yarn in back, I'm going to slip the first stitch, dropping those extra wraps, slip the second stitch, and slip the third stitch. Now I'm going to bring my yarn to the front of my work in between those 2 needles, take those stitches, put them back onto the left-hand needle, bring my yarn around to the back, slip them back, bring my yarn to the front, slip them back, bring my yarn to the back, slip them to the right-hand needle, bring them to the front, slip them to the left-hand needle, bring them to the back, and then slip them to the right-hand needle again. And you'll see what I just did on that stitch was wrap those 3 stitches 3 times. Pretty easy. And then you will just continue to knit across. Now, when you come to those stitches on the next round, you'll just knit each of the 3 stitches individually. Then you'll continue to work in stockinette stitch, working 2 sections of the undyed sections plain. And when you come to the third one, you will work a hay bale stitch again. Now, it is up to you. This is your knitting. If you're in the mood to work more hay bale stitches, go for it. Know that your cowl, you'll be using up more yarn and your cowl won't be quite as high if you do that. You could also, every so often, I think once or twice in my cowl, I was like, oh, there's a hay bale stitch right there. I don't feel like working one right now. And I would just skip one and work an extra undyed section. Or I'd be chatting with a friend and forget to work a hay bale stitch, and it really doesn't matter. So your yarn is driving and telling you what to do, but you are also at the head of this tractor and you can kind of decide it is not time to roll with the hay in that moment and skip one. I'm so excited what you guys all think. Oh, talking is hard. I'm so excited to hear what you all think about this. It's such a fun project and knit, and I think I've dyed 5 or 6 skeins at this point because at first I was trying to figure out how to do it, and then I was like, I think I need to dye one more and see what happens if I do this or that. It's been very fun for me to play with, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be for you too. So, please ask questions if you have any. I am always happy to answer them. We'll have knit along threads in the Ravelry group and over in our Facebook group. You can leave questions below here or questions over there. I am happy to help you have success rolling in the hay with Lola. Happy knitting.